By most measures, horror games try to scare you with what you can see. Resident Evil, which inspired Silent Hill, is a great example. Older games used to have a lot of orchestral stingers, monster roars, and sudden jump-scare sounds. Audio was usually a supporting actor. It warned the player, made dangerous situations more intense, and highlighted the scary moments. This is known as adaptive scoring, a concept in game audio that simply means that music should react and adapt to gameplay. But Silent Hill took a different approach. It scares you with what you can hear, and sometimes with what you can hear. The music and sound design stopped supporting the horror, but in turn, they became the horror itself. And Akira Yamaoka understood it better than anyone else. He joined Konami in the early 90s and worked on relatively conventional games before he got his hands on Silent Hill. He said that he felt constrained by traditional game music expectations and saw Silent Hill as an opportunity to do something genuinely experimental and new. Though funny enough, he wasn't a die-hard horror fan, but rather a person who was simply obsessed with music and happened to work on a horror project. And this is important because his outsider perspective shaped everything. For example, in horror media like movies, games, and literature, you learn that inside is always safer than outside. You run indoors to escape the monster. The house is your safe place. The darkness outside, or the fog in this case, is where the threat is supposed to live. This is deeply wired into human psychology, and that's why it works. Shelter means walls, which means defensible, which means safety. In a way, it's primal, and Yamaoka looked at it and realized that it's the perfect weapon if you subvert the expectations. The outdoor fog in Silent Hill serves multiple purposes. First, it was a trick to mask draw distance limitations at the time, but most importantly, it functioned as a horror element. Yamaoka used it as his playground for ambient drones and distant, almost untraceable sounds. The music outside is often oppressive and unsettling, but it's telling you something. It's basically a signal. There is radio static when enemies are nearby, ambient noise beds that rise and fall in intensity. The entire soundscape is talking to you. That plays into what we're used to. We have information, despite the information being frightening. But when you step inside, well, something fundamentally changes. The core principle is restraint. Single sounds and large portions of silence. As soon as you step inside a building, the textures and ambient tracks cut out. All you get is a dance of single sounds and silence. Sometimes it's a door, sometimes a distant moan. The brain can't stop itself from trying to find where the sound is coming from and decide if it represents any danger. It makes you wonder, did I actually hear anything? Or am I hallucinating? And the most brutal aspect of it all, that will probably ruin a little bit of magic for you, is that in Silent Hill 2's apartment buildings and hospitals, some sounds exist without sources, meaning that you can never quite reach them physically or identify them. You'll hear something and try moving toward it, and it will either stop or seem to come from another place altogether. From the technical standpoint, it's fascinating, because if you were to recreate it yourself, the sound sources have to almost play cat and mouse with you. They have to track how close you are, only to go quiet if you get too close, and pass the torch to another, more distant sound source. It creates an unsettling feeling that something is definitely out there, but it's always hiding. And if you do run into an enemy after fighting it, the silence is deafening. This might be the most effective technique because it goes against everything you're used to in horror media. You stop trusting your ears. But there's also a concept in horror that we could call the uncanny valley of safety. It refers to spaces and situations that have the features of safety, like walls or roofs, but feel deeply wrong. The indoor silence in Silent Hill exploits it without shame. Your rational mind says, I'm inside, there are walls, I can see the room, I can defend myself. But your nervous system says, something is wrong with this room, and I can't tell what. The gap between rational understanding and bodily response is where Silent Hill thrives. The outdoor noises, as frightening as they are, give your nervous system something to react to, but the indoor silence gives you almost nothing to work with. And that silence is scarier to the nervous system because it can't prepare a response. The hospitals in Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2 are probably the best examples of this design philosophy. Hospitals already carry a heavy cultural weight. We associate them with pain, illness, death, and suffering, humans at our most vulnerable moments. But in Silent Hill, they're also completely silent in a way that feels eerily wrong because hospitals are never this quiet. The silence in Brewhaven Hospital is particularly sophisticated because by the time you reach it in Silent Hill 2, you've spent time outside in the foggy town with its ambient noises, and the contrast is genuinely brutal. The game essentially tunes your nervous system like it's an instrument and then subverts it. Yamaoka has talked about wanting the player to feel like they've gone somewhere more intimate and therefore more dangerous. The outside world is vast and hostile, but the inside world is close and also hostile. That closeness changes the nature of the threat entirely, and there's something thematically resonant here too beyond just pure techniques. Silent Hill stories are psychological and internal. They're about guilt, grief, self-punishment, and psychological fracture. The monsters aren't external threats so much as manifestations of the protagonist's feelings and state of mind. The shift from loud outside to silent inside mirrors the thematic movement. The fog and noises of the exterior world are almost like the noise of ordinary life, the static of being in the world. When you go inside, you go inward. The silence is the mind confronting itself, which is where the real horror of Silent Hill lives. But sound design is just one part of how Yamaoka made Silent Hill truly terrifying. Music is the second piece of the puzzle. His set of influences and inspirations was wild. The industrial noise of 9 Inch Nails, the atmospheric emptiness of Brian Eno, the cinematic sadness of Angelo Badalamenti, and even Massive Attack. This is an unusual combination, and the tension that arose from this combination became the defining characteristic of his sound. For example, the otherworld cues in Silent Hill aren't really musical in any conventional sense. Yamaoka constructed them from layers of heavily processed feedback, guitar distortion, reverse reverb, time-stretched samples, metallic percussion, and rhythmic noises. What's remarkable is that this madness was intentional. He understood that in a horror game where monsters are literal manifestations of the subconscious mind, these atonal or rhythmic sounds would create anxiety at a primal level. Silent Heaven from Silent Hill 2 is a great example. It's not really musical, and if anything, it sounds more like someone smashing the pipes a few stories down in a stairwell. But that's exactly why it works perfectly in a psychological horror game. Though Yamaoka perfectly understood that horror is not always scary sounds and monsters, sometimes horror is the emotional devastation, and he communicated it through a range of songs. It's usually quiet pieces, typically made with clean or lightly distorted electric guitar, and sometimes acoustic. They draw heavy inspiration from Americana and alt-rock traditions. It sounds like Mark Lanigan or Nick Cave. The specific guitar tone that he used for these songs is very important and interesting. He had to communicate emotional devastation in a beautiful way, as if it's played in an empty room, which suits the abandoned, echoing spaces of Silent Hill perfectly. It sounds cold, lonely, and lost all at the same time. He used minor keys with unresolved or ambiguous endings that trail off rather than resolve, which creates a sense of emptiness and incompleteness that fits the world around the character perfectly. And the theme of obsession and grief is mirrored through simple and repetitive motifs. They're not complex at all. And to really sell discomfort, most of these songs are slightly slower than what would feel comfortable, which makes them feel heavy. The song called Letters is the perfect example of it. It's a melancholic guitar piece that, despite not being aggressive or utterly sad, still manages to devastate you emotionally through its simplicity and repetitiveness. Theme of Laura is another great example. It's not technically complex, the chord progression is relatively straightforward if you were to recreate it yourself, but the combination of that guitar tone, the tempo, reverb, and the fact that it keeps almost resolving but doesn't, creates a feeling of yearning that's inseparable from the game's themes of a man who cannot let go of his dead wife. And from Silent Hill 3 onward, Yamaoka brought in vocalist and voice actress Mary Elizabeth Maglin. This made the soundtracks deeper and emotionally richer. Mary has an unusual voice for this kind of music. It has power and precision, but they used it with rawness and vulnerability that fit not only Yamaoka's aesthetics, but also the game's themes perfectly. The songs that they created together function almost as internal monologues for the game's protagonists, discussing emotional states that the characters themselves couldn't or wouldn't voice. And lyrically, the songs deal with themes of abandonment, self-deception, the impossibility of moving on, and complicity in one's own suffering. They're not horror lyrics by themselves, but in the game's world, they become loaded and overly haunting. Everything Yamaoka was making was evolving with each game. For example, the first game was raw and more lo-fi. The limitations of PlayStation 1's hardware actually worked in his favor because it gave the compositions that compressed and degraded quality. Silent Hill 2, for example, is considered the masterwork. He had more processing power to work with and a script of unusual emotional depth. Every piece feels calibrated to James's specific psychological state. Not just generically scary, but sad. In a specific way a guilty person would feel sad. And the score is also more varied in the second game. By the time Silent Hill 3 was in the making, Yamaoka started working with McGlynn. There was a shift toward gothic, feminine aesthetics, and the emotional register also shifts from grief to rage and trauma. And Silent Hill 4 was probably the most experimental. The game's premise gave Yamaoka permission to make music that felt genuinely claustrophobic. Some pieces are almost pure texture, with no melodic context. Storytelling in video games through music and sound design is genuinely hard, and when it comes to horror games, it's almost like playing on hard difficulty. But if this is something you're interested in, consider subscribing, because we cover a wide range of games here and their storytelling through music, sound design, and gameplay mechanics. And as always, stay awesome and keep making this world a better place.